particularly among such an esteemed gathering of alum and current students. Welcome to parents and families who are here this weekend to celebrate your student. And what I'm going to do is first go back about, 20 years ago now, which actually sounds a little scary to be able to stand here and say that, but about 20 years ago, I was in Central Park in New York City with about 30 to 35 10, 11, and 12-year-olds from Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. And we were there preparing to ice skate. And as is often to happen for any of you who have spent time with early adolescents, they are probably best equipped outside of family and close friends to really zero in and tell you about yourself with any kind of unabashed inhibition without displaying any of it. And so I, for that day, was the subject of this analysis. And so as we were there preparing to take the ice, one of the young people said to me, "So, Miss Brookins, you're not really from here, are you?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" "Well, you don't really talk like you're from here." And I said, "Well, okay." And he said, "Well, you don't really act like you're from here." And I said, "Wait a minute, hold on a second. How does somebody from Bedford-Stuyvesant supposed to act?" And so another young person pipes in. He said, "Well, I can tell you one thing. There's not a lot of them that can skate like you can." And so we proceeded through the day enjoying, the ice skating. And for a number of young people, even though they were from Brooklyn, they had not been in Central Park before. And as the day progressed, there was another question that was posed to me. And the question from a young man was, "So why do you teach here?" And I, in all of my full intellect and academic wonder, start launching in on this speech about how, I love to teach because of the subject area and the ability to break down new learning. And he went, No. I didn't mean that. I meant, why do you teach here? And so implicit in that question, I understood, was the question, why do you teach here, meaning why do you teach in Bedford-Stuyvesant? Implicit in the question, why do you teach here, was why do you teach here, because you could clearly be teaching someplace else. And finally, in the question of why do you teach here, as other young people turned to kind of listen in to hear what my response was going to be, was the question, why do you teach us? And in thinking back and reflecting back on that day and the answer that I gave at the time, I responded, I teach here because I like to prove people wrong. Because I get a high and a kick off of the exception to what everybody else believes is the rule. I teach here because, in fact, it might be easier to teach in other places, and I want to be in the room when you surprise people. Because one of the great parts, by the way, of teaching in Bedford-Stuyvesant and in urban centers in general is that, and I continue to say this wherever I go, is that some of the smartest, most perceptive young people I've ever had the chance to work with have been in urban areas. And we had very frank conversations. So I continued my response and I said, because you and I both know that there are a number of people who would never expect for the cure for cancer to come from someone who looks like you. And you and I both know also that there are many people who would never dream that an award-winning playwright or poet would come from our neighborhood. And still better yet, in some respect, many of you also know that in our schools, people would be astonished to find a future Fields Medal winner in the field of mathematics or the creator of a new source of energy. And I want to be in the room. I want to see people's faces when you accomplish all of that and more. And so in reflecting on that response, what's interesting about it is that it represents a time in my life where I realized that all of the liberal education that I had had the opportunity to experience was actually now not just impacting me as an individual, making individual choices about which class do I want to take and where do I want to go, but that actually I was experiencing the synthesis of what this E.B. White quote really captures. And that is how how can I synthesize the dichotomy between this desire to improve the world and a desire to really enjoy or savor the world, right? There was part of me that enjoyed learning, and a lot of that was because, frankly, I was the beneficiary of a liberal education, an education that empowers, an education that celebrates and promotes critical thought. But at the same time now, I was being charged with being a steward of liberal education on behalf of others. That the same person who was a student here and had the benefit of being, again, pushed and charged to do more and to think differently, I now was responsible as the teacher. And in addition to being a participant, I was now actually a facilitator of that learning. And so within that story, what really does begin to bubble up to the surface is not just the power of a liberal education to help us think differently about the world, but as many have spoken before me today, this other narrative about our ability to impact the world in small, seemingly small ways, with whether it's 30 to 35 students in one or two classrooms in a school in Bedford-Stuyvesant, or whether it's the 83,000 students that I represent on a regular basis now in Baltimore City. This other aspect of a liberal education for me is the power of a liberal education to impact others beyond ourselves. And part of this empowerment is really grounded in our ability to be able to think differently, as others have said, to think in complex manners and ways, to think about the diversity of a view and opinion, and to push for change in not only our own thinking, but in those of others. Now, what's interesting about this is that in some ways, and I learned this very early when I was part of the team that started Teach for America back in 1989. And one of the things that a lot of young people went through in those early cohorts of young Brown and Harvard and Wesleyan and University of Virginia graduates who were going out to change the world, one of the things that I learned very early in helping to found that organization was that if you make the mistake of thinking that there's going to be a red carpet rolled out for you, right, when you get there, you're going to be in trouble and you're probably not going to last. The other thing I found is that what young people respect most, particularly early adolescents, remember, only the brave teach middle school, particularly in early adolescence, is that they can sift the part of you that connects with them while remaining yourself. They don't like teachers who come in and act like I know exactly what you are and I'm your best friend. They don't want that. They do want people who are real. And so what's very interesting is that when I reflect back on my time here at Brown, what's interesting is that seemingly being very different from them, and yes, many of them were African American and I happen to be African American, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that simply that meant I knew their experiences. Many of them had been through things I had never been through, nor do I want to go through. But I had an experience that within its core here at Brown helped me to relate to this idea of education as being a method of empowerment. And so, I'll take you back now to 1985, giddy freshman that I am, entering Brown's campus. My parents had said goodbye to me, and my father's parting words were still ringing in my head. And what he said to me was, I want you to have a good time, but remember, Brown didn't put anything in you that wasn't already there to begin with. And I want you to remember that being a Brookins is still the most important thing. But what you will gain here is that you will find other people who are just as curious about how the world works, who are just as interested in learning, and who are just as able to push your thinking as anyone else. So I had that all in my head. I was a giddy freshman, ready. I had picked my classes, and I don't know if we still have them here, or Brown still has it here, but we had these wonderful freshman entry courses with like cross-disciplinary study, and it was wonderful because, I was like, wow, we get to learn everything at once with these different themes, which is how I liked learning anyway. So I was all excited only to come and have in those opening weeks, for the first time in my life, my very right to be part of an academic community challenged at the very core, to have my very intelligence put on trial. So in those days in the fall of 1985, what plastered the Brown Daily Herald was this question of, well, did everybody who had gotten into Brown really deserve to be here? Did everybody meet the entrance criteria really? Were there quotas? Who really belonged here? And so for the first time in my life, I thought, could they mean me? No. They couldn't mean I shouldn't be here. I had never had that kind of frontal attack. I mean, sure, of course you deal with prejudice and people dealing with you different ways, but never that kind of frontal attack on something that was so central to my core. So, what was ironic, though, about that dissonance is that it connects me with a lot of my young people who I serve every day, who merely by walking down the street have people question almost their very humanity, who don't see them as the curious young people that I see them as those who can put things together, take them apart, shake them up, see if it works, and in the process find a new way of doing things. But that's not the end of the story. What's so powerful about that frontal attack that I experienced was that actually in the very place that had challenged my right to be there, I found the proof and the reinforcement of who I am. And what was interesting is that it was in my interactions with professors, with colleagues, walking into Diana Fuss's class freshman year because she was teaching the themes of childhood, and walking into her class, and I'll never forget being so paranoid about going to my first writing conference with her, just sure she was going to tell me, actually you really don't belong here because you can't write. And instead got something very different. Got, oh yeah, well you can write. You knew that though, right? Didn't tell her I wasn't sure, but nodded yes. And she said, but that's not the issue, Sonja. It's not whether you can write. Because you do a great job citing what other critics say about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You do a great job. You cite all the sources, your grammar and your diction's fine, but where's your voice? Where's your take? Where do you think they're wrong? Why aren't you pushing? I feel like you're giving me the static back when really what I want to hear is your song. And it was at that stage, at that moment, that I was liberated. I was given the tools, the space, the verification to say, actually, I can push back. Actually, because someone else put something in print and it resides in a dusty volume at the bottom of the library, doesn't make it more valid than my thoughts or my push. And so as part of that, what was really interesting was there was a connection between me and my students. This idea that Freire talks about, that actually, apart from inquiry and praxis, we actually wouldn't be human. That there's an essence to liberal education that actually makes us part of the larger human race. And so as I went on in classes with Anani Degenjo, as he began to push and say, really? Are you sure that the African diaspora, right, can be, it means that we're all the same? Are you sure? How do you know? What about this counterpoint, right? Or going into a Chinese politics class, only to find out that some of those debates and questions that I thought only resided in one place actually reside throughout all of history. And so it is within this frame that I engage the work now of young people. Young people who need their voice, who deserve their voice, who need to have it verified, who need the academic tools and skills to be able to assert their personhood, their minds, their greatness on behalf of us all. Not just because I want them to have a better life, but because truly I believe latent in these human vessels is greatness. And it's within that I push for all young people everywhere, regardless of where they come from, to be able to have access to those same tools, those same thoughts, that same dialogue and exchange. And the end of that story is that when I came to the end of my time at Brown, I found myself facing a dilemma. And the dilemma was, ironically, that the African American students' graduation celebration was scheduled at the same time that the Phi Beta Kappa installation ceremony was. Now, you don't have to be a modern culture media major or an English major to surface the political quandary that posed. Why would anybody have scheduled both of those at the same time? I found myself with a dilemma. Which one do I attend? Do I go with the masses of some of my colleagues and celebrate my cultural background with my family and all of that? Or do I proceed to this celebration of an honor that I assume has some kind of capital along with it, something worthy of separation? And the beautiful part about, again, a liberal education and the comfort around these dilemmas is that in the end, it was not me. It was mentor professors. It was older students who had gone before me who were alum. It was younger students who looked at me, who said, you need to go to the place where you're least expected to be. You need to be the exception. You need to be the dissonance. You need to be in the place that shows the power of what a liberal education brings. And it is for that. It's the fact that I still root for the underdog. I still don't enjoy rooting for the Patriots nearly as much now as I did when they won that first Super Bowl with Adam Vinatieri's kick. And I still get a high when one of my kids calls me back from Bedford-Stuyvesant and says, I want you to know, not only was I the exception to the rule and I was the one that people didn't expect, but I'm no longer the exception. I have others with me. And you need to know that it does matter. Thank you.